Good evening, and welcome to Chicago Public Library. I'm Jennifer Lezak with the Cultural, Civic, and Literary Engagement Team in the Adult Services Department. And on behalf of everyone at Chicago Public Library, welcome. Before we begin, we ask that you please silence your cell phones. I would like to thank the Chicago Public Library staff who worked to make this event possible and our bookstore partner, Sandmeyer's. Books are available for purchase in the lobby, and the author will sign books at the conclusion of the program. We will call you up to get your book signed in groups, so please remain seated after the program and wait for instructions if you wish to get your book signed. Tonight's event is also being live streamed on CPL's YouTube and Facebook channels and will be available for on-demand viewing immediately following the event. After the conversation, our guests will take questions from the audience from those who line up at the microphone in the front of the stage. Virtual viewers, please put your questions into the chat. Chicago Public Library is pleased to once again partner with the Society of Midland Authors on a fantastic program. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Claire Hartfield to introduce tonight's guest, Ray Long, author of The House That Madigan Built. Welcome, Claire.
Good evening and welcome. I am Claire Hartfield and I am the program chair for Midland Authors. And I'm excited to be continuing the long and vibrant history of programming that we have offered for many years. Before we start tonight's program, I want to encourage you to mark your calendars for our October program and to give you a little sneak peek of that. It will be on Tuesday, October 11th, starting at 6 o'clock at the Cliff Dwellers Club. We will have award-winning poet Deepika Mukherjee, who will share her latest book of poetry, which focuses on home, kinship, and loss, emotions that we can all identify with as we're coming out of the pandemic. Deepika will be in conversation with poet Marty McConnell, and she will be accompanied by dancers from the Ishti Collective, and it promises to be a wonderful evening and encourage you to attend. To learn more about this event and about other Midland Authors news, I encourage you to visit the Midland Authors website, which is really easy to remember. It's midlandauthors.org. You can also pick up a brochure on the table that's just outside the auditorium. And if you are new, please add your name and email address to the sign-in sheet on the table outside. But today you are here to hear the stories about the storied Mike Madigan. And I could not be happier and more excited to introduce Ray Long, distinguished journalist and author of the new book, The House That Madigan Built, The Record Run of Illinois' Velvet Hammer. Ray Long is a Chicago Tribune investigative reporter who has covered Illinois House Speaker Mike Madigan and Illinois politics for more than 40 years as a journalist, writing for the Tribune, the Associated Press, the Sun-Times, the Peoria Journal-Star, and the Telegraph of Alton. In addition to Madigan, Ray Long has also covered 2 governors who went to prison and a state senator who went to the White House. An award-winning journalist, Ray is a 2-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Please join me in welcoming Ray Long.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you to Jennifer also. Thank you to the Chicago Public Library and to the Midland Authors group, and also to the University of Illinois Press. And I'd like to tell you I still got a day job too, so if you get some tips, bring them to me or send them to my email at rlong@chicagotribune.com. But here's why we're here, to talk about Mike Madigan. As you heard Claire say, I covered him since 1981. So I was an intern, so green I didn't know where the bathroom was in the State House. And I was an intern for the Alton Telegraph, a downstate paper that is based across the river from St. Louis. So Madigan in 1981 also happened to become a legislative leader for the first time in that year. So I was able to watch his arc all the way from the time that he was a legislative leader the first time he was Minority Leader Madigan, and through the speakership and through Minority Leader Madigan once more for 2 years. But in 38 years, 36 of those years, he was the Speaker of the House. That is a nationwide record, and he was always able to get reelected until the final time when he could not get reelected by his own caucus, and they dethroned him. So what I want to do tonight, of course, is give you a little update. Of course, as you know, he's been indicted on 22 counts. They range from racketeering to extortion to bribery-related counts. He has pleaded not guilty. And what I want to do is kind of walk you through how Mike Madigan built up this image as a legend. And I want to tell you a couple stories about that, and I want to tell you what I consider the turning point, and then we'll talk a little bit about the fall. So the first story I want to tell you about that falls in the legendary category is the night that the White Sox stadium was passed in the legislature. You'll remember back in 1988 that this was a big deal. They thought that the White Sox were going to Florida. They thought they were going to St. Petersburg, and it looked like, all signs looked like they were headed that way. Florida had made great economic incentive packages, and they were trying to lure them there. So what we saw was that it came down, as you would imagine, because you know the legislature in Springfield is like almost every other legislature. They wait till the last minute. Back then, June 30th was the deadline for passage of bills that would come into effect immediately. And so midnight, June 30th, was viewed as the cutoff date for passage because nobody thought that after June 30th they could get a 3/5 majority, which would have been needed at that point to pass a bill and have an immediate effective date. So here we go. Thompson comes in about 4 o'clock, 4:30 or so. He'd been out and about on June 30th, and he looks around at his staff, and they're all glum. And he says, why? Why are you so, why are all the glum faces? And they said, oh, we're not going to pass the White Sox bill. And he goes, no, that is not going to happen. So he goes charging up the stairs to the Senate, to Senate Minority Leader Pate Phillips' office. And Pate, of course, was a longtime DuPage powerhouse. And Thompson goes in and says, you know, Pate, I need this. We got to keep Chicago as a 2-baseball team town. There are very few towns in America, New York, LA, Chicago, that can claim 2 baseball teams. You know, this is a city of big shoulders. We don't want to lose one of the shoulders here in the baseball world. So Thompson starts pulling people in off the floor. They go into Pate's office. They're pulling them in one by one, and Thompson starts reminding everybody, hey, this is personal to me. I really need it. Remember all these things I've done for you in the past, et cetera, et cetera. He might have even been cutting a few deals for the future too, but he said he didn't give away any big stuff, whatever that meant. But he pretty soon brings everybody around, and Phil Rock then is the Senate president, and it took a while to get all these votes together. So it's coming around to 11 p.m. Midnight is the deadline. Finally, Tim Degnan, the senator from Bridgeport at the time, stood up and said, you know, I need 30 votes. We hope the bases are loaded. Please bring us a grand slam. And so they start voting. You start seeing these Republicans pop up. We in the press corps, this was happening so fast, we were just kind of listening and hearing this develop. A lot of people had already written stories for early editions that said, you know, the White Sox chances are dim. It looks like they may be headed to Florida. And so we had all of a sudden this movement on it. And sooner or later, all these people who had been opposed to Republicans in the suburbs started popping up and saying, hey, Adeline Giocaris, a senator from Zion, the White Sox, I love the White Sox, but you know what? I don't think they ought to be in Florida, and I like Florida, but the White Sox should be in Chicago. I vote yes, and sooner or later you see all these people jumping up and voting, and finally they got their 30 votes. But it was not until 20 minutes till midnight. And so Thompson, they get their 30 votes, Thompson goes tearing across the rotunda. They open up the big doors there, the big wooden doors in the house, and he's got spotters out above all of the various people who might be persuaded to get their votes, to vote yes for the White Sox stadium legislation. And so he's got spotters there. Madigan's running around also trying to get his piece of paper that has all the people who could be persuaded there too. The place is starting to become louder and louder, and there's a broadcaster there named Charlie McBaron who was giving this play-by-play. This was such a big deal then that he was actually broadcasting it like it was a sporting event. You know, Thompson's out there behind the back of the room. He's up next to a desk. He's waving his arms. His palms are up. He's shaking head. Yes or no, it looks like we've got another vote. So he's going on, and there were a couple of guys from Peoria. One was a Democrat, one was a Republican, and they were pointing back at each other. They were downstaters. They'd been opposed to the bill, but they were ready to go on if the other would, but they didn't want to go first. They were pointing back and forth. Finally, they get a burly firefighter named Don Saltzman, stands up and pushes the button no. Well, it looked like the clock was really going closer and closer to midnight. But the reality was the clock was in Illinois time, not in real time. So what happened was I was up on the floor and I looked up at the clock and suddenly it's disabled. You no longer see the time there. Instead of actual seconds and minutes, you see kind of disoriented figures flashing up there. They'd put on what they called the shot clock or whatever when they were trying to time different speeches. But anyway, you could not tell what the time was. Charlie McBaron, the broadcaster, was going, I don't know what clock they're using, but it's getting really close to midnight here. And so Jim McPike, the majority leader, suddenly goes up to the podium and takes the gavel away from Peg Breslin, who was a representative from Ottawa, and she had been opposed to the Sox bill. McPike takes the gavel, starts rolling things really fast, and sooner or later, you know, Charlie McBaron's again saying, you know, I don't know what clock they're using, but it's really, really, really close. They're going to be running out of time here. And there were people out in the chamber, opponents, who were going 5, 4, 3, 2, counting it down like it was Times Square. There were others singing the Sox song, na, 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 hey, hey, and they were talking it down, and sooner or later, McPike says, okay, Mr. Clerk, take the record. Usually that is the end of the vote, and then they'll just slam the gavel and go on. McPike didn't slam the gavel. He starts looking around. He says, so-and-so, you want to change your vote from no to yes? Yes. You want to change your vote? You want to change your vote? Sooner or later, they're down to 59 votes. And he calls one guy and says, you want to change your vote? And the guy stands up and says, no, I don't want to change my vote. And so it's a setback. And then, you know, clearly it was past midnight at this point. You even heard on Charlie McBaron's tape that he did of his broadcast, that big electronic sound that goes off at the top of the hour. And you heard that beep go off, and you knew it was past midnight. So what happens is McPike then looks over at Thompson. He's waving frantically. He's got his coat off. He's standing there in his suspenders, waving frantically. And he's standing over a guy named Jim Stang, a Republican from the suburbs. And Stang announces, I'll vote yes. And they hit 60, and it was pandemonium. Everybody was standing up, yelling and screaming. The people who were against it were throwing paper up in the air, and the people who wanted it were cheering. And McPike suddenly says, Bang, at 11:59, the bill passes. So we run up, we grab the roll call, and it says 12:03. And so we're running over to Thompson, we're saying, hey, you know, it's after midnight. It's after midnight. He says, no, it wasn't. The speaker said it was 11:59. Speaker Madigan said, my watch said 11:59. No court in the land's going to go against this. And the truth is, it did go to court, but it didn't succeed. They went with the speaker's gavel of 11:59. And still the bill roll call in the archives of the Secretary of State says 12:03. But there was a judge in Florida who kind of put it all together, and he says, you know, only 2 times in recorded history has time stood still. Once in the Judeo-Christian Bible, and once in the minutes of the Illinois House. So that's number one. That's one of the times that he started becoming a legend. But the very next year, in 1989, he had been opposing Jim Thompson, Republican Governor Jim Thompson's proposal for a 40% income tax increase. He wanted to push it from 2.5% to 3.5%, which is not bad considering today is like 4.95. But anyway, he wanted to push it up. Madigan had consistently opposed it. It was almost like a robotic response when you would ask him about it. He would say, I'm not convinced of the need for an income tax increase. And he did that for 2 years. And then he came back a 3rd year. And then in May, all of a sudden, he's decided he's going to have an income tax increase. He's not telling anybody about it. And he's secretly putting together this plan. This just happens to coincide with Rich Daley's first term, first election in office, and he was $120 million short or so for the budget. And so the schools needed money, the city needed money, and downstate, Madigan had gone to some of his legislative members' districts, including in Effingham. Some people considered this like the biblical Saul going out and being hit by lightning, but he suddenly decided to pull this together and very quietly was getting ready to spring it. Now, I just happened to be with one of the great reporters of the press room, a guy named Bill O'Connell, who worked for the Peoria Journal-Star. He was my mentor, and he had the scoop. So did Charlie Wheeler and Mike Sneed at the Sun-Times. So those reporters put it on the front page, and it was very quiet. Everybody was quiet about it. Nobody knew this was coming except for Madigan and his members. And so the paper hits the stand, and there's pandemonium. It hits the newsstand in the Capitol, and there's more pandemonium. Madigan's talking about a tax increase. He's been opposed to it all along. This is the anti-tax guy. He's not going to keep up his opposition. He's going to flip over here. And so anyway, Thompson comes roaring into the building early on in the morning. It's a little after 9 o'clock, and he's chugging up the stairs, and of course the press corps, I was one of them, who swarmed him trying to get his reaction, and finally he doesn't say anything for like 2 flights of steps. You know, we're reporters, we're not exactly in shape here, so we're running alongside of him, and then he stops at the 3rd floor, which is the one that the House and Senate are on, and he says, I want to go ask him if it's true. So he goes down to Madigan's office. Then he, from an interview I had with Madigan years ago, he said that what happened then was Thompson comes in, Madigan picks up one of the papers, and he goes, "Banzai!" And so then within 6 hours, and the biggest raw power play I've ever seen, Madigan passed an income tax increase, a temporary 20% income tax increase that pushed the rate from 2.5 to 3%, and he pushed it through the House in 6 hours. It was, that may not seem fast to anybody, but I tell you, that is lightning speed for legislation. And so eventually it went over to the Senate. They had to negotiate back and forth, and it eventually came across and passed with a little property tax relief. And so that was the second really big moment that was a legislative point that really buttressed this whole legend of Mike Madigan. So he, of course, did many other things. He was a master strategist. He was a big-time fundraiser. He was really good at drawing the legislative lines, the boundaries, and redistricting when every 10 years after the census, they redraw the lines and try to put everything tilted toward Democrats, of course, if they win. But even when he lost in the redistricting battle, he was able to hold the House, even though the lines were drawn for Republicans. He was able to hold the House 4 out of 5 times, in 4 elections out of 5 elections. So then let's flash forward. Of course, I believe that the turning point for Madigan was back in 2018. I was sitting doing my job at the Tribune Tower, and I started getting phone calls in. These are from people that, don't just randomly call, but people that I'd known for decades. They were saying, hey, there's a sexual harassment case going on in Madigan's headquarters here in Chicago, and you might want to check it out. You might want to be looking into this. Well, the year before, I'd written a story about a sexual harassment case of the guy who headed security at the 2 airports, and he had been at the tollway, and he had a big sexual harassment case there, and I was able to dig that out, expose it, and a few days later he was gone. But these are not easy to do, and you have to be very, very meticulous when you dig out very sensitive information. So I started working the phones, and eventually I was able to get a go-between to have me meet up one night with a photographer and me, Stacy Westcott, a great photographer and video photographer at the Tribune. We met up with Elena Hampton, and that was February 11th, a Sunday night. It was after dinner. And so we met with her, and she told me this story about how she had given her life to being a Madigan campaign worker. She'd worked hard for him for several years. She grew up downstate in a little town called Pleasant Plains outside of Springfield. She had worked up in the city. She had worked various campaigns. She had worked Juliana Stratton's campaign in the 5th District and was one of the campaign managers in that campaign when Juliana Stratton ran against Ken Duncan, who had Duncan had gone on, sided with Bruce Rauner multiple times, which upset Madigan, and Madigan went after him and beat him. But Lena was a key player in that. And so she told me that after she told me, and she had many texts that backed it up, that she had been harassed by a guy named Kevin Quinn, who had sent her a variety of texts, asked her out multiple times, and he was a guy who was giving her assignments to do this and do that for the campaign, et cetera. But he kept asking her out, saying things like she had he saw her on a Facebook post and she was in a bikini, she looked smoking hot, et cetera. And she would write back, I just want to do my job, this is what I have been working for, et cetera, et cetera. Well, so I get back after the interview. I've got texts, copies of texts. Stacy had videotaped the interview. I had taped it. I had asked all kinds of questions, and I was trudging back across the bridge there on Michigan Avenue toward the Tribune Tower, and I'm thinking, you know, it's going to be maybe 2 months to really go through and verify all this, because it's one thing to get one person's side of the story, especially in something like this, but you got to verify. And sometimes Madigan's folks can play cat and mouse, and you can't get down to the nitty-gritty. So I get there, I typed up some notes, I leave about 1:15 a.m. It's snowing, it's quiet, the streets are quiet because of the blanket of snow out there. I get home, I come back early, I get in, and then about 10 or so, Madigan puts out a statement that says, I fired Kevin Quinn, or I've ousted Kevin Quinn, and he had a courageous woman had come and talked about how she had been harassed, and therefore Quinn's out. And I'm suddenly like thinking, wow, I've got his side of the story already, and I'm also thinking, wow, did they try to get ahead of this story because they knew I had been doing this interview, or what? Now, they swore that they didn't, but, you know, coincidence, I don't know if there's such a thing. But anyway, they said they didn't, and they said, and they had Madigan had put his lawyer on the case and had checked it out and all that before they pulled the trigger on Quinn. And then next thing so everybody in town has this story, except they don't have her name. Madigan did not name her. We put out a little story that told about Quinn being fired. Everybody else in town said the same thing. It was February 12th. Nobody is in at the state offices on February 12th. And so it's hard to get a hold of people. It looked like it might be a one-day story, except we had all the stuff, and we were burrowed in immediately and started putting together a package, put together for the internet that ran out right after the 10 o'clock news started. We didn't want to get beat on our own stories, so we ran it out, waited for the competition in the tubes to start their broadcast. We rolled it out, and then we ran out a big front page package the next day with her quotes, with her explaining everything that was going on, and Madigan's explanation too. Well, this started a cascade of issues there. Elena had a press conference in Chicago that day. Madigan had a press conference, a dueling press conference in Springfield that day, and they were all talking about why this culture had been allowed to happen. And eventually there was some legislation that went through. It wasn't really as strong as it should be, but there were some changes made. Elena eventually sued Madigan's operations, political operations, and there was eventually a settlement. And she is now a public or a political consultant around town and has worked for various other people, but she hasn't worked for Madigan. And later, that same spring, right at the end of it, Lou Lang, a longtime assistant majority leader for Madigan, stepped down, and he had been accused by a marijuana advocate, somebody who was pushing for the legalization of marijuana, of sexual harassment. He stepped down from his position as a leader and on legislative inspector general, ethics committee, and then he later ran for election and won, and the legislative inspector general, which an office that had been vacant, was suddenly filled, and they looked at him and said that they could not uphold the charges because the marijuana advocate had not participated in the case. And through multiple interviews with other people, they couldn't support it. But Lang then left the legislature after he was reelected. And then shortly after that, that was like a prelude to a woman who came up here, a clerk who worked under Tim Mapes, the chief of staff, who doubled as the House clerk. And she held a press conference up here and accused him of sexual harassment, and he was gone within 3 hours. So Mapes, who has also been indicted for alleged perjury in the Madigan case, was out too. And so there was this cascade, and there was this kind of lingering effect that continued. But the real final straw, that what many people called it, was the federal prosecutors came up with a deferred prosecution agreement with ComEd. In that agreement, in July of 2020, they had acknowledged that they had put many Madigan people on their payroll in jobs that required little or no work, and that they were doing that in hopes of persuading Madigan or getting Madigan to go along with their legislative agenda. And also, they acknowledged that they had put a bevy of college interns from his ward, the 13th ward on the southwest side, into a variety of college internships too. And then finally, you remember that ComEd is a state-regulated utility. ComEd acknowledged that Madigan had pushed for a guy named Juan Ochoa to be on their board of directors. And they put Juan Ochoa on their board of directors too. And so Madigan was pointed out as public official A in that deferred prosecution agreement. And it was clear it was him because it even said the Speaker of the House. They didn't name him, as they don't do, but they said the Speaker of the House, et cetera. So it was clear it was Madigan. And so that created problems in his caucus. A woman, Representative Stephanie Kiffelwit from the suburbs, said, "This is it. I'm not voting for Madigan for Speaker." Then she said later, "I'm going to run for Speaker." And then there were several others who started saying, "I'm not going to vote for him for Speaker either. I'm not going to vote for him either." Then they had several before the election. Then the election came, and Tom Kilbride, who was a justice of the Illinois Supreme Court and had enjoyed Madigan's support for decades and had received $500,000 from Madigan in the closing weeks of the campaign, lost. He ran for retention. Judges, once they are in, they run for retention. They don't run against another person. People vote them in, and if you get 60% of the vote, then you stay. He didn't achieve the 60%. He got something like 55%. That was a warning sign to a lot of the lawmakers. Madigan's caucus lost one person. That, might happen in a year, but he was pouring money into some of these legislative campaigns. We had legislative races we'd never heard of before that were suddenly showing up on TV, but he didn't make a dent. In fact, he lost one in his caucus. And then the other big thing that Madigan did was push for J.B. Pritzker's effort to have an income tax, a graduated income tax, so that the people who earn the most are taxed the most at a higher rate. And that was beaten too. And Madigan was viewed as part of the reason, or the part of the baggage. After this all happened, after the election, and people started looking at things, they were looking around for somebody to blame. And Dick Durbin came out and said, I don't think he ought to be chairman of the Illinois Democratic Party anymore. He'd been that since 1998. Tammy Duckworth came out and said, hey, I don't think he ought to be the Speaker of the House or the chairman of the Democratic Party. And J.B. Pritzker, who had always been kind of dancing on whether he supported Madigan or not, he actually said, yeah, I don't, if these are true, he should be held accountable. And so then more people in Madigan's caucus started coming out against him and saying they weren't going to vote for him. And then his longtime pal, Mike McLean, got indicted shortly after the election too, along with former CEO of ComEd, Ann Pramaggiore, and a couple of lobbyists, John Hooker and Jay Doherty. And they got indicted for schemes involving pushing legislation through on behalf of ComEd. So Madigan was working the phones, as he always did, after an election, but this time he wasn't getting a full set of, yes, I'm going to sign on with you, I'll support you, Mr. Speaker, yes, sir, etc. And eventually, he came down to Springfield, and he could only get 51 out of 60 people that he needed to vote for him. And he had a caucus of approximately 73 people, but he couldn't get more than 51. So after a few days of this, he surprisingly says, I'm suspending my campaign. And he decides at that point to see if anybody else can get 60, can put together 60. And as you know, Chris Welch was able to do that. And Madigan had even called him aside, according to reports. Madigan had called up Welch and said, Chris, do you want to be speaker? First clear it with your wife, and then start checking with the Black caucus, and then check with the Latino caucus and the downstate caucus, and start sewing up the votes. Eventually, that happened, and a few weeks after Madigan slowly walked off the stage, being the ex-speaker, he resigned from his position, and he resigned from the House. So that is what I wanted to tell you about it. Give you a flavor for, a lot more is in the book, of course, but I wanted to give you a flavor of a couple of things that showed he was a legend, and a couple of things, or at least buttressed his legend, and a couple of things that led to a turning point and led to his fall. So if you have questions, let me know. Well, that'll be easy. First, you need 40 years to cover him. But in all reality, that was part of it. I was in a position where I thought, man, I've got all this time that I've covered Madigan, and I think that somebody ought to do a book, and it ought to be me, but man, I've got to go through all kinds of drafts and pitches and all that, and I just never got to it. And then one day, I'm working away on a story, sitting at my desk, an email comes in from the U of I and says, would you like to write a book on Mike Madigan? And I'm like, yes. So then, of course, what I did was I kept it pretty low-key. I didn't tell everybody I was working on this book. I wanted to keep it low-key so that, Madigan allies couldn't just go around and try to shut everybody down. And I knew where I wanted to take it, but I knew that I didn't want to write a biography where I told about him eating Wheaties when he was growing up, or what he did in his teenage years. I wanted to write about his public life and the things that impacted people. So the next step was, do I do a chronology? If I did a chronology, it would be really confusing because so many things take so many years to go through the legislature. So I could be starting to talk about the pension crisis in 1980s, and then I'd have to go into chapter 6 and start saying, remember when I talked about the pension crisis? So I decided I would take the topics and like pensions and play it all the way out, and take Operation Cobra and play that all the way out, fights with Rauner and play that all the way out, and do what the folks who reviewed the book for the U of I came up with a great idea, and that was, put these in 5 different sections so that you have the legend. So I had the Cobra and the White Sox and redistricting in one, because those were the ones that were really legendary and people could grasp those. And I had timed several other individual ones, including leading up to the fall at the end, where I went through all of the various investigations that we had written about and broken stories about over the years. And so then I started writing it. I had a couple of heart surgeries during the time I was writing it, not because of him, just because it was congenital. But you know, so that slowed me down some too. But you know, I was blessed to have had all that time to pull it together, blessed to have worked, to be married to a wife who was also a former editor. So we were able to bounce ideas back and forth, and she was able to tell me when I was going down the wrong path. So it really helped having somebody there the whole time to work with too. And I really focused on trying to bring each one of those chapters to make them approachable and readable. Now, you know, the pension one's one you got to really geek out on, but the others, I think, pretty much handle that and follow that pattern.
Good evening, Ms. Long. I want to have a two-part question.
Sure.
Person to pick your brain. Do you know who said the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants? You know who said that? The tree of liberty must be refreshed.
Was that Patrick Henry or some? I can't remember.
Thomas Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson, okay.
Second quote is, the revolution is always inherited by the youth. Who said that?
Who was that?
Huey P. Newton. So my question is this. In your judgment or opinion, figuratively speaking, would you judge Mike Madigan as a patriot or a tyrant whose blood may refresh the tree of liberty?
I don't really take a position because I'm still covering this, right? I don't want to slant one way or another. I just follow the truth. I believe that Madigan was a strategist unlike anyone else. He was a guy who would look at the bills and figure out how he could slant them toward his party and to help the Democratic cause and to help him stay on the throne. But as far as what his eventual legacy will be, I think we'll know more once the jury comes out, if it goes to trial. And I'm sorry that doesn't give you a black and white answer, but
That's fine.
but that's
So-
I think his legacy will be determined how this case turns out.
So the second part of my question is this. You know, on December 4th, 1969, Huey P. Newton and Mark Clark was shot, politically assassinated by a Chicago police officer.
Yeah, Mark
So
Clark.
so their blood was literally shed, in your opinion or judgment. You say their blood was the blood of patriots or terrorists?
Well, I got to think about it.
Okay.
But I do believe that from everything I've read about that there was no need for the police to go in and start shooting at Fred Hampton and Mark Clark in the way that they did. There had to be better ways to do things, and I just think that history has proven that there were better ways to do things.
All right, well, thank you, Ms. Long.
Thank you, sir.
Curious, could you touch a little bit on the dynamics between Madigan and Daley and the city and the state, and also should he be nervous if Ed Burke talks, or if Blagojevich starts to talk, should he be nervous, and will there be another ComEd? Like, is that just the tip of the iceberg?
Yeah, sure. Mike Madigan had relationships with both Richard J. Daley and Richard M. Daley. Richard M. Daley and Mike Madigan were both members of what was the Constitutional Convention, the CON-CON, that reached the Constitution that we have now. It was in 1970. Mike Madigan was a young, I think he was around 28. Rich Daley's about the same age. Madigan's 80 now. And they had kind of an off and on relationship, Richard M. and Mike Madigan. But like I said in the Operation Cobra story, Madigan came through for Daley with the income tax increase that helped fund the schools and helped fund city government. So he could serve as a protector of the city, and he did that for many administrations. Richard J. Daley, Madigan was a young committeeman of the 13th Ward, and he'd go in and that was a whole different time where patronage was a lot freer, and you could get your jobs and go in and talk to the mayor every month, and I believe that Madigan clearly revered and still revered. I don't think there's anybody as far as a politician, he would revere more than Richard J. Daley. And he also, I think, as his career played out, I think you would see that he adopted many of the same kind of strategies that Richard J. Daley had. In fact, he has a prayer card from Sis Daley's funeral that had a picture of the first Mayor Daley, Richard J. Daley, and his wife, Sis Daley, in there, and he has that framed, or he had that framed on his desk, or in his office anyway, in Springfield and up here. And he would look at that at times, and when he was trying to decide what to do and think, well, what would Richard J. Daley do in a case like this? So clearly there was an affection for Richard J. Daley, and he had an affection for the city overall too, Mike Madigan did.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation tonight.
Thanks.
I'm wondering, what advice would you have for Midland authors who are currently tackling or planning to tackle such large and sensational topics such as yours?
Well, one thing I talked about with one of the previous questioners was figure out the structure, because if you want to do an enormous dive like a Robert Caro, you're going to spend years and years and years of it. If you're going to do hundreds of interviews, then you've got to figure out what you want to be asking them about ahead of time. For me, I had done the interviews over 40 years and put them in stories and was able to pull them out and use a lot of my stories, a lot of my fellow Tribune reporters' stories, a lot of my competitors' stories. If they beat me on a story, I'd cite it in the book, you know. And I think one thing you got to figure out is, do you want to do all that original legwork yourself, or do you want to use some of the work that's already been done? In my case, I wanted to do some of the work that had already been done. Otherwise, I'd still be writing this book today. If you've got an original topic, that's harder to do, of course, but I think you want to figure how you're going to do it. Like I said, if you want to do Robert Caro, that's great, but to me, that wouldn't tell enough of the point. Sometimes you have to just get to the point, and I think the points that I wanted to bring out were the different types of things that Madigan did well and flopped on, and as a public figure, rather than go all the way back to, you know, his grade school days and et cetera.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you for being here tonight. I look forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
I understand you're still covering these issues, but Illinois' finances are a mess. And are you able to say how much of that Madigan is responsible for. He ran the state for 40 years.
Yeah, no, it's a fair question. I mean, he has even said while he was speaker, well, I take responsibilities for the various things, including the pension issue, which is truly the albatross that hangs around Illinois right now. And the state's mess with pensions is unconscionable because lawmakers for years and governors for years just did not fund the pensions well enough. And as a result, we will be paying not only the principal but the interest of this extraordinary debt that's over 100 billion with a B for years, trying to tear it down. Now, what J.B. Pritzker and the Democrats who control the legislature now did was they used a lot of the excess funds that they got through the coronavirus help from the federal government and shifted them around to free up money so that you will now be getting checks right before the election that will be billed as property tax relief. And you'll be able to get some other things too if you have, you'll get more if you have children, et cetera. But I scratch my head when I see money going back out to people, even though everybody's going to be glad to get a check. Is that really the responsibility? Is that really the responsible thing to do?
All right, if I may, just another very quick question. Yeah. What about Lisa Madigan? Do you expect her to reappear on the political scene?
I think it's going to be tough for Lisa Madigan to come back at this point. I think she was a rising star. She had a shot. She could have taken it. She didn't want to take it while her father continued to be speaker. At least that was what she said. And I think she could have run against Quinn in 2010 after he had taken over for Blagojevich when Blagojevich was impeached. The next election was 2010. She very well could have run a campaign against him in the primary, and it could have been a bloodbath, but she could have possibly won that. She could have then also run again in 2014, but that was when she said, I'm not going to do it, and I'm not going to do it as long as my dad is Speaker of the House. And so now it's become such a big money game where you've got a billionaire governor who can throw tens of millions of dollars into the pot. And before that, you had Bruce Rauner, who was also, you know, depending on the day and the stock market's good or bad swings, he was a billionaire too. So that's difficult. And then it's going to be, I think, very difficult for her to overcome the idea that her dad was indicted in federal court on 22 counts. So I think it would be extremely tough for her to come back. But this is Illinois. A lot of things can happen.
Good evening. From the perspective of your research and experiences in journalism and so on, putting the whole thing on a ledger basis, positives, negatives, et cetera.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Putting it on a what?
The whole Madigan subject on a ledger basis, positives and negatives. Looking at it from your perspective and experience, and also as a citizen of the state, was that much power concentrated in one person for so long a net good or bad for the state in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. Charlie Wheeler, who did the foreword in the book, Charlie is a former Sun-Times reporter who I mentioned, who also had the scoop on Operation Cobra. He became a journalism teacher and ran the master's program at University of Illinois at Springfield. He's still around. He still gives political commentary. I asked him to do the foreword because he had covered Madigan when he was at ConCon in 1969. And Charlie, this was before the indictment, wrote in the foreword that he believed it was a net positive for all the things that Madigan did. And then he said, but you can make your own decision based on the following chapters that I did. And so I want people to read what I did in the book and make their decisions. And I still have to cover him. So I'm not one to, come down on a full opinion on that. I'm still working the beat.
And we have one more question from our virtual viewers, which says, can you explain more about the current charges against him and your sense of how it may turn out? What do you know what he's doing now? Is he still active with his law process?
Well, the charges were outlined in this story when it happened, and I can go through a lot of those, but they really did follow a lot of the things that I talked about in the deferred prosecution agreement, where they talked about how he could, how he had worked to put people like Juan Ochoa into the board of directors for ComEd. They also told an interesting story about how Lisa Madigan in her last years as Attorney General was pushing for a consumer-oriented proposal to impact utilities. And Madigan and his pal Mike McLean, the ComEd lobbyist and former legislator, were not totally keen on it. Certainly McLean wasn't. And Madigan, at the end of the day, ended up with Ochoa getting a board appointment and a few other folks on the ComEd payroll, allegedly, and the Lisa Madigan legislation died. So there were a lot of different things in that indictment that we're still sorting out, and we'll still be fascinated to see. Now, Madigan right now has put in $8 million from his campaign war chest to pay his lawyers for the defense. And he is still, from what I'm told, going down to the ward office where he's still committeeman and has been, like I said, since 1969. And he occasionally goes out with friends, but fewer and fewer of them have called over the years since the indictment, or over the months since the indictment.
I think that's all the time we have for today, but on behalf of the Chicago Public Library, we want to thank Ray Long and the Society of Midland Authors for a wonderful program. I want to remind you that this book is available for sale from Sandmeyer's in the lobby, and if you want to have your book signed,